Paradox Interactive has an interesting stranglehold over map games. Map games are a thing to more people than just me, right? What do I mean by that? Is Civ a map game? Maybe, but I feel like the vibe tilts GSG, and it is indeed a vibe. One temptation is to define map games as a nebulous genre in the same way that Bethesda games are a thing, referring to the work of the studio as the genre unto itself. But Paradox isn't the only studio that makes map games, they're just prolific. Also, not every Paradox game is a map game, even if they are grand strategy games. For example, something in Stellaris, perhaps the ungrounded nature, the symmetrical starts, makes it feel like less of a map game to me. But by that same token, I wouldn't call Total War games map games either, because despite the static and historically grounded start conditions, the gameplay isn't all map. All this raises a few questions about what defines a map game, and I can't do that perfectly. It could probably be an endless discussion with as many exceptions as there are rules. More interesting to me is exploring the way maps play into these games, a conversation I don't see all that often, which is interesting given the map and the games are near inseparable. The way we're going to get into that is by looking at some quirks I've noticed, and they'll help reveal a bit of the way these maps have some unintended politics, so to speak. Not in the sense that they show a bias towards a political alignment, so much as that they accidentally make statements about history through what they emphasize. Beyond that, we'll see issues of mutability and the primacy of experience over historicity. With that, let's get into the legacy of two cities in Victoria 3, the transformation of geography, and something called historical predestination. Though not my first impulse when opening Victoria 3 for the first time, confirming Jan Mayen was step one of the things I did early on was check the map to see how they represented places I've been to and lived throughout my life. For reasons that will be made clear, the two most recent places happened to be an interesting case study in how Paradox does cities, at least in Victoria 3. Glasgow, a city in Scotland, was on the map, but not the major city for that state. For those who don't know the game, every state has an assigned major city. Edinburgh was the Scottish Lowlands city. Wheeling, West Virginia, my home before that, was not so lucky. I fully acknowledge that in isolation these will look like nitpicks, or maybe like I'm being one of those weird, why is place that matters to me personally not the center of the universe in this game people that occasionally pop up in map game spaces. I'm picking these places to talk about because I noticed them, and part of noticing them is having learned about them, and having learned about them is partly due to having been there, etc. I would never presume these are the only examples of vague map negligence in the game, and while there's a risk I'll invite the weird nationalists to speak up in saying this, I invite people to comment the ways games and their maps have altered or written their homes out of history. With that said, let's get into why these two examples just happen to be rather egregious. And we'll do that using some real-world history. First, Glasgow. Glasgow is today a large municipality with a middle-sized population in global terms. By the loosest of terms, its population is around 1.3 million, and by the strictest, around 500,000. London, by contrast, has 10 times that by the loose terms. Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, is in strict terms and loose, smaller. But we aren't talking about now, we're talking about the 1830s and the potential of the space up to the 1930s as per the framing of Victoria 3. Glasgow of the 1800s was a very different place. In fact, it was, at this time, occasionally declared the second city of the empire, an unofficial title of general recognition of relevance or a concentration of wealth, population, or power. Glasgow had, for much of the Victorian era, all three. Prior to 1836, Glasgow was already a major trade hub benefiting from colonial trade, that is to say, the triangle trade, that is to say, slavery. Many of its wealthiest citizens were slavers. Though the trade of slaves was made illegal in the British Empire before the start date and Glasgow itself was never a major slave port, the wealth accumulated via industries reliant on slavery held no restriction and was critical in the development of the city. I would, however, be remiss in neglecting to point out that the arguments of abolition were strongly fostered in places such as Glasgow University. If you want a glimpse into Scotland's history of complicity and empire, there's a video by John the Duncan I can point you to. If you want reading resources, well, look no further than Dr. Stephen Mullen's It Was Nae Us, The Truth About Glasgow. Point being, before the time period, Glasgow was relevant to the mechanisms and history of the British Empire on the whole. In terms of local relevance, as early as 1821, Glasgow had surpassed Edinburgh in population and in industrial capital. As for the game's time frame, for global relevance, by some estimates before industry declined in the 1870s, Glasgow produced a third of all locomotives in the world. A vast majority of Category A listed sites, that is, protected historical buildings, in Glasgow were built in the 1800s, many concentrated into the 1840s through 80s. In 1896, Glasgow built a subway system, then the third in Europe, behind London and Budapest. Suffice to say, it was not playing second fiddle to Edinburgh, not in terms of development nor relevance. So while the wealth of the region started before the frame of Victoria, it certainly flourished during Victoria. Oh, and side note, it's also not on the map in EU4. Ayrshire covers the land it's on, and the named city for that province is, unsurprisingly, Ayr. I suppose the odd frustration is that, of all the eras Paradox has covered, the Victorian era is when Glasgow is unambiguously at its most relevant. Now, I don't expect Paradox to ever act to change that, splitting off Greater Lanarkshire, or whatever they'd call the southwest of Scotland from the southeast, would only serve to buff Great Britain, which starts in the #1 spot in terms of most game metrics. I just thought I'd note how wrong one's sense of history might be if derived from the game. As for why it's like this, well, it's likely not ignorance so much as that the mechanics of the map don't allow for history here. Glasgow on paper is not the capital, but Edinburgh is not purely administrative and small. I note this contrast because Victoria 3 has no problem making New York City the major city of the New York state in-game. Albany is secondary. Buffalo doesn't show up at all, or maybe it does? It's hard to tell because cities get added on with certain building thresholds. Anyway, Buffalo not being there is extra weird given there's a Niagara Falls modifier towards power plants in the game, which seems to reference a huge part of the history of Buffalo and the region in the real world. But back to Albany, US state capitals seldom align with being the major city of a state in real life, and the game tends to follow the popular guess/historical reality as what the city of the state will be. I wager many people from outside the US, maybe even outside the East Coast, maybe even outside New York, didn't know Albany was the state capital. Here's a fun one. What's the capital of California? What's the capital of Florida? Hey, what's the capital of West Virginia? Which leads us to Wheeling. Wheeling is a city in West Virginia, and I swear to God, if anyone starts singing Country Roads, I will personally give them spoilers for real-world history. Wheeling is a city in West Virginia in the real world situated on the Ohio River in the northern panhandle of West Virginia, which seems to only exist to shorten the border between Ohio and Pennsylvania. According to the game, it doesn't exist. Up front, I think part of the reason is that it's stuffed into the corner of the state and would, if growing, expand in a really weird shape according to the map rules, and it would bleed right into Pittsburgh, a neighboring city and fellow industrial hub across the border in Pennsylvania. So why is Wheeling getting a worse deal than Glasgow in my opinion? Well, let's get into the history of West Virginia in the time period, starting with when West Virginia became a thing in the first place and why. Originally, and perhaps unsurprisingly, West Virginia was part of Virginia. The state split over the Civil War, with West Virginia seceding from Virginia and thus the South. This couldn't be modeled in-game, so they're just split from the get-go. And no, there is not an East Virginia. But there is a Western West Virginia and an Eastern West Virginia, but such is the way of places named after compass directions. At the time, Wheeling was Virginia's second largest city and a center of trade and transport given the B&O Railroad and the Ohio River. As a hub of immigration in the working class, removed from the broader Virginia slavery-driven cash crop economy, Wheeling became a hub of abolition. When the Civil War sparked, Wheeling was chosen as the state capital for Virginia as a government in exile, so to speak, until it was declared wholly distinct as West Virginia. That's right, West Virginia was founded on anti-slavery, and Wheeling was the capital. By 1865, in the conclusion of the war, Wheeling was no longer the capital, but it remained an important industrial center. In turn, Wheeling was also a center of labor activism. The local industrialist, Augustus Pollack, was a German immigrant who opened a cigar factory but was considered a fair boss. That's not a term you'll hear me use often. Enough so that he didn't suffer the same strikes and industrial action that much of the region faced through the late 1800s, largely avoiding the generalized tension of the coal wars that in other places led to incidents like the Battle of Blair Mountain. The local trade unions actually encouraged members to go to his funeral. I bring this up to say that, walking around the city, there are many monuments to labor and liberation. There are also some that have yet to reconcile what should be an uncomfortable relationship with Native Americans, but as much as it warrants mention, it's also outside the scope of the timeline. The city's prominence in the era of Victoria III is no better displayed than in the remnants of Victorian and Gilded Age homes. The city's decline no better evidenced than in being removed from the position as capital and the eventual population decline following the Great Depression and post-war flight of manufacturing to nearby Pittsburgh. Neither of these spaces, Glasgow nor Wheeling, are in their marginalized map position due to inherent politics, but the maps necessitate a change in history. Mechanics, or rather aesthetic function, take primacy over accuracy. While I suppose one could argue in at least the Wheeling case that in the Vic 3 timeline Wheeling never ends up being picked as a capital or to be relevant or something, that feels like constructing a technicality around an excuse. And it's to my point in the sense that the game's map gives a false perception of history, however slight the dip into historicity is in the first place. Here's a sentence that sums it up but won't mean much to anyone outside Scotland. The shipbuilding industry in the game for the Lowlands is in Aberdeen. Overall, these sorts of map decisions aren't the type to be read for politics. For a concise final example, Washington, D.C. being a state in Victoria III isn't a declaration of Paradox's politics with respect to the question of D.C. statehood. It's a mechanical function of how the game is structured. Generally, with games, there's ideas about what comes first and what compromises should be made in order to make the game as good as can be. It would be uncontroversial to say that graphics shouldn't get in the way of gameplay. A stunning vista isn't worth an unplayable frame rate, exciting animations aren't worth disrupting combat flow or tedium, etc. Actually, now that I've made that claim, I'm sure there are many counter-arguments and niche cases against those ideas. Relatedly, gameplay and historicity are also always going to be at odds, but I've discussed that before, and also kind of always discussing it anyway. If we narrow it down a bit and talk about map presentation, more in terms of detail and topography in the place of graphics, we get a new but similar question. How does the map play into map games, and in turn, a representation of history? When does accuracy lose out to gameplay as far as maps are concerned? Possibly the most malleable of geographic features is straight crossings. Said malleability suits gameplay, our star example being Venice. It's a small thing, but it highlights the relation between play intent and geography fairly well. The presence of a crossing in EU4 makes a Venetian navy even more worth having. By contrast, Crusader Kings entirely lacks naval combat, and by extension, while boats are a limiting factor to invasions, that's only on the direction of how many troops can be ferried by the enemy. Which, CK3 made even simpler given that boats just kinda spawn in, though granted, the old system was finicky and everyone I showed the game to would stumble over trying to load troops onto boats for CK2, so the change was probably good, but that's tangential. There's no historical reason, no moment or deciding factor between these games that says, until 1453 it was impossible to walk an army into Venice, or after 1444 it became impossible to walk an army into Venice. Another example is the North Channel between Scotland and Ireland, which is selectively a strait depending on the game. It's not consistent or correlated to eras or technology. It's not impossible to cross in CK2 and then possible in EU4 as a sign of the times, if you follow. Beyond crossings, there's changes that seem more to do with player expectations or popular understandings, but we'll get there. And finally, there's some plain odd ones, like Vancouver Island, which is in Vic 3 not an island, like at all. Some of the maps and the projections get a bit weird around straits. I should clarify, straits in the real world sense. Discerning islands that are on most sides of the sea, but on one side a river gets tricky fast when you're looking at a game where most rivers are a terrain effect, not a hard border. But this is something different. Normally, I'd expect it to be more like how the game treats Anglesey in Wales, which in the real world has a strait on one end that is very shallow, so functionally an island, even if it's river depth. Point being, there's not a ton of consistency even when gameplay isn't impacted. But with that said, the reason the maps change between games has everything to do with gameplay, unless you're looking at the Netherlands and their campaign to desertify the North Sea in the name of the Great Gouda in the sky. Other times, I'm not sure what the intent is, but generally we can at least understand the decisions as figuring into the machinery of these games, the structures that help form a sort of historical predestination. Maps in these games manage to dictate the flow of history. These games are, by design, asymmetrical due to historicity. It's a lot of the reason why I was so excited to discover them after a lifetime of Civ. No stronger felt is the asymmetry based on map conditions than in Europa Universalis and Victoria, where, in an effort to simulate real history, the resources of a land are static. In fact, we can go a bit further. Land masses themselves are static, and as a historical game, they ought to be. But that, curiously, undercuts one of the elements of those eras, more so in EU4 but to some degree in Victoria as well. Exploration is functionally weakened as an experience by real-world knowledge of the new world. To illustrate, I'll turn to a DLC introduced to EU4 to combat that very issue, Conquest of Paradise, a DLC that included a new world randomizer. The intent was to make it feel like the player, if in the Eastern Hemisphere, really was exploring, grasping the shape of a wholly unknown landmass, if not outright intended as an act of immersion, then somewhere near it. The base game can only emulate exploration in terms of being a race to take as much land as possible, and in the semi-randomization of resources in the yet-to-be-colonized lands. But let's look for a moment at the idea of static resources and how they shape the events of a given run, the history to be. One funny thing that's happened with Victoria 3 in particular is players stumbling into lessons of 19th century economics. Funny as they are, in a sense, accidental and imperfect and messy lessons, often predicated on iffy AI. One such example is the time a player remarked that their industry's demand for oil outpaced domestic supply. In turn, the player was forced to invade somewhere. Now, that sounds farcical on its face, but let's not be too hasty. The forced wasn't a woe is me, I have to destabilize Iran sad face. It was because, in the player's view, the AI should learn to build its own resource deposits properly. Accidentally, this AI in action leads to a gameplay incentive towards colonialism that imitates a teaching moment. The problem is that said inaction is not a function of tech and resource deprivation, it even hits the developed nations. Sicily routinely fails to tap into its massive reserves of sulfur despite being a stone's throw from a region heavily lacking any access to the resource besides a small deposit in southern Greece. The player frustration then blurs because the lack of peaceful means of obtaining resources ends up feeling unintended. But all of this stems from having those intrinsic resource sites. This gets a bit towards the, for gameplay reasons, forms of absurd when it comes to crops. Yes, crops tend to favor certain environments better than others, but there is no means of introducing new crops to a region. They're all predestined, or at least limited by history, not by possibility. Note, however, that the potential of a plot of land is a bit different in EU4, where development could technically be poured into any given province. Anywhere could become the largest city in the world. While Victoria could kind of have that, provinces are much more limited in their potential, and due to the way population works, for better or worse, certain land masses have a soft cap on population, which creates some remarkably messy attachments to the starting peasant populations in arable land. This is one of the things I actually hope they find a way to work around the most with Victoria. They've kind of fixed some of the worst offender regions, like how Argentina used to have a very low amount of arable land, which meant it couldn't actually become a competitive immigration hub, having little room to grow despite its history proving otherwise. But in other cases, the system still has odd quirks. The short way of explaining is by looking at China. China has to start with a huge population, but most all of them are peasants. But in order to do that, there has to be a very high arable land count per province so that there can be enough subsistence farm slots. This creates a bit of a double bind. Either China has provinces that now have far too much potential, or whatever we imagine this potential comes from is simply not transmissible to the rest of the world. United Borneo has 83 arable land slots total. Borneo, by the way, is the third largest island in the world excluding continents. It is 3 Britons by area. Just the home counties and West Country together are 90 arable land slots. I understand arable is the operative term, but let's dissect that. One could argue that it's due to how inhospitable the jungle areas are. Sure, but it feels inconsistent and implies that where other places in the world historically were able to quote-unquote tame the jungles, drain marshes, what have you, the places that historically didn't, cannot. There is no version of Victoria history where Borneo can be cleared of its forests, so to speak. Which brings us to the source of some of this predestination: player expectations. Okay, small tangent about the way I play. I often like to see if there's tall, viable locations or strategies in these games. Blobbing doesn't interest me much. Sensible borders of an empire, sure, but even then, if we're talking Crusader Kings, I like to try and keep a feudal patchwork to a minimum for myself as well as vassals. Not very historical, I know, but that's apparently my power fantasy. To that end, I look for places that have tightly packed potential or natural boundaries, or as CK deigns, immutable duchies. To that end, Bohemia is a favorite. Köln and Aachen are favorites, and I thought that like in CK2, Flanders would be strong in CK3, but that wasn't the case. Flanders in CK3 has seen a severe reduction in holdings. This one is interesting to me because it contrasts with another high-value nearby land. Amsterdam is destined to someday be the Venice of the North, but not for centuries on. In the time of CK2, it's a rough and untamed area, but for some reason in CK3, the area is already tamed. But then in EU4, Flanders is packed with farmland and cloth provinces destined to be high development. The region has differing visions that fight between history and player expectation. In general, I think Paradox games are at their most compelling when they hit that balance between offering me alt histories and a machine that can potentially produce history as it happened. Land and its conditions are things that heavily define potentials in these games, ostensibly a tool to railroad a country if not towards success, then in some cases towards obscurity. Just as in games with characters and rosters, history games, map games, develop expectations, and while they're allegedly grounded in historical reality, or indeed that if the expectation is historical then it should fit the game just fine, well, sometimes they kinda don't. An example of this is Morocco, or more specifically Tangiers, which has a higher average rainfall than London and a climate more like the Mediterranean than even parts of southern Spain. Despite that, it's classified as a dryland. To be fair, I'm not actually entirely confident this comes down to the expectation that North Africa is a dry place, or if it's down to how simplified the geographic designations are. I mean, a fourth of Iberia is dryland, but when is the call made on that, you know? In general, it's a blur, but I do think part of it is the player expectation that North Africa is dry. In the end, it's something that makes me think about how the limitations of the land do end up being the hardest boundaries to alt history in these games at times. The limitations of land are also places where player choice is rather limited. One cannot, as the spirit of the nation in Victoria, redraw state lines, change the boundaries of tiles to better optimize them. One cannot, as ruler of a state in EU4, choose to change the resources produced in the capital, for example. Only an event may do that. And I understand that from a gameplay perspective, and I recognize the optimization hellscape that gameplay could become if even more things were mutable. But it's interesting to consider how the parameters of the map affect potential and vision. A topic I originally wanted to tap into with this video was the politics of maps, things like map projections and the surprisingly touchy subject, if my comment section is to be believed, of Victoria 3's changes in Africa. But in truth, the through line of play and politics are connected only in that a map must be chosen for a given game. Due to player expectation, familiarity, projections like Mercator tend to get used more often, even as games modernize their approaches to history. In turn, it would be better to tackle that subject from the other side, talking about the history of map projections and how it spills into Paradox. But I think getting into the way maps allow play at the expense of history, or cannot model history given the mechanics of play, is a crucial step towards being able to discuss the way these games are, by virtue of projections, railroaded towards a political position. Just as the maps provide a structure for the play of certain nations, the maps display a view of the world. In diving into the history of two cities that hardly exist in the game despite being in their historical prime, and looking at how the boundaries of geography are changed between games to suit mechanics, we understand that Paradox games are gameplay first, history second. And that's fine. In fact, I'd wager it's an implicit mantra for making these games, probably with the caveat that it doesn't mean throwing history out entirely. Perhaps Venice was tested without a strait and it was unfun. And besides, straits don't represent some immutable real-world condition. An army can't swim to Venice. It might also be good to keep in mind that terrain gets patched, transforms, splits as development continues and complexity is added to regions. That too is in service of fun first, history second. All I know for now is I can't make Wheeling a metropolis, a hypothetical Venice of the Ohio. I can't build Glasgow to be the second city of the empire, and though I understand why, these cities get shortchanged as far as representation is concerned. And in the end, what we take away from this is that the maps aren't infallible. Hi again, it's been a while. I was moving and doing things that make it hard to work. I also got halfway through another big video before derailing to make this one. That one's serious and about the real world, so I expect it won't pull in the crowds. This was supposed to be a really short tying up of small thoughts I had about the Paradox game maps and quirks, but it felt better to give it an actual structure rather than being an oh, and another thing weird semi-list thing. Anyhow, thanks for watching, and I really do mean what I said about commenting if you've got a place in mind that Paradox maps just seem to overwrite. That stuff fascinates me. Also, thanks to my patrons who patronize me. Special thanks goes to John Ursaw, Defender, Freddy, Galactic Beyond, Mark Soto, Nick, Newt Sturgeon, and Queen Naked Molerat. That's it for now. Sometime in the future there will be another video. How's that for a promise? Bye.